What if the most dangerous lie you ever believed about your mind was also the most ordinary one? Not that you are broken, not that you are incapable, but that your intelligence has already been decided, that somewhere between genetics, school, and childhood labels, the ceiling was set, and all that remained was to live beneath it. A lot of intelligent people carry this belief quietly. They do not say it out loud, but you can feel it in the way they hesitate before hard things, in the way they admire brilliant minds from a distance, as if genius belongs to a different species, as if clarity, depth, and mental sharpness are something some people are born near and others are not. But history keeps disturbing that story. Einstein was not recognized as extraordinary when he was young. Darwin did not look like a future intellectual giant. Edison was dismissed altogether. And yet somehow, the minds once underestimated became the minds that changed the shape of thought itself. So the unsettling question is not whether intelligence matters. The question is what actually grows it. Because if the mind is more alive than we were taught, then maybe the real tragedy is not having a fixed IQ. Maybe the real tragedy is living as if your mind cannot deepen when in fact it still can. And that changes everything. Emotional recognition. You probably know what it feels like to sense unused capacity inside yourself. Not in a grand, arrogant way, in a quiet way. The feeling that your mind could be clearer than it is now. More disciplined, more original, more powerful in ways you have not fully accessed yet. But modern life creates a strange illusion. It makes you feel mentally active while keeping you cognitively shallow. You consume all day. You read, scroll, watch, save, listen. You are surrounded by ideas, yet somehow your own thinking feels thinner, more fragmented, less memorable than it should. And after a while, you begin to misread the problem. You think maybe you are distracted because you lack discipline. Maybe you are mentally tired because you are not built for depth. Maybe other people are just naturally sharper. But often the issue is not that your mind is weak. It is that it has been trained into passivity, which means the real question is no longer, how smart are you? It becomes, what kind of conditions is your mind living in? Deeper psychological insight. For decades, intelligence was talked about as if it were a number locked inside the skull. Stable, measurable, almost moral in the way people treated it. High enough and you were praised. Too low and your limits were assumed before your life had even unfolded. But neuroscience has made that picture harder to defend. Not because every part of cognition changes equally, and not because effort magically overrides biology, but because the brain is not static. It reorganizes under pressure, it adapts to repetition, it responds to difficulty, attention, retrieval, rest, and environment. In other words, the mind you use is shaping the mind you become. William James understood this long before brain scans could show it. He wrote that the nervous system grows to the mode in which it has been exercised. That line matters because it shifts intelligence from identity to process. It suggests that what feels like talent is often structured adaptation repeated over time. And that is where this becomes personal. Because many people do not lack intelligence. They lack the habits that give intelligence somewhere to grow. Habit 1. Deep thinking without input. Most people today try to get smarter by increasing input. Another video, another summary, another podcast playing while they walk, eat, clean, and commute. It feels productive because the mind remains occupied. But occupation is not the same thing as thought. Some of the most important mental work begins only when external stimulation stops. When there is no voice guiding you, no screen arranging ideas for you, no fresh content to lean on, that is when the mind has to generate structure from within. It has to connect, question, simulate, and reorganize. And that internal effort is far closer to intelligence than endless consumption ever was. Einstein did not become Einstein by living in constant input. He spent long stretches in mental solitude, turning simple questions into entire universes of thought. He followed paradoxes until they opened. He let imagination remain unresolved long enough for insight to form. That kind of thinking looks empty from the outside, but inwardly it is dense, which is why boredom feels so uncomfortable now. Not because boredom is useless, but because the modern mind has forgotten how to cross through it. First comes restlessness, then irritation, then the urge to escape. But if you stay, something subtle begins to happen. Thought gets deeper. Associations become stranger. Questions stop being borrowed and start becoming your own. A smart mind is not only a mind that takes in information well, it is a mind that can remain alone with a question long enough to produce something original. Habit 2. Struggle before help. One of the quietest ways intelligence weakens is through premature rescue. We reach for the answer too quickly. We search before we wrestle. We get explained to before we have even fully confused ourselves. And because the discomfort disappears fast, we assume we learned something. But the brain does not deepen when it is merely relieved. It deepens when it is forced to work through uncertainty. Psychologists sometimes call this productive struggle, but the phrase sounds cleaner than the experience. In real life, it feels irritating, slow, humbling. It makes you confront the gap between what you thought you knew and what you can actually retrieve, organize, and express. Benjamin Franklin trained himself through this kind of friction. He would study strong writing, put it away, and try to reconstruct it from memory, not because he enjoyed difficulty, but because difficulty exposed weakness. And once weakness is visible, the mind can start reorganizing itself around it. This matters because passive understanding is one of the most deceptive feelings in the world. Something makes sense while you're looking at it, and you mistake recognition for mastery. But the moment the support disappears, so does the clarity. Struggle interrupts that illusion. It asks a harder question. Not, do I recognize this, but can I rebuild it? And that question is where intelligence becomes real. Not when the mind is handed a structure, but when it learns to generate one under pressure. Habit 3. Writing to think, not to record. Most people treat writing like storage. A place to keep facts, plans, reminders, and fragments they do not want to lose. But some of the clearest minds in history used writing for something else entirely. Not preservation, investigation. Leonardo da Vinci did not write like a student trying to prove he had learned. He wrote like a mind trying to catch itself in motion. Questions, sketches, contradictions, half-formed observations. His notebooks were not polished because he was not documenting certainty. He was thinking in public on the page. That is what writing can do when used properly. It slows thought down enough to reveal its weakness. A vague idea can feel intelligent in the head because it is still blurred by intuition. But the moment you try to write it clearly, the illusion breaks. You notice what is missing. You notice what does not connect. You notice where your confidence was only fog. And that is not failure. That is refinement. Because a mind that never externalizes its thinking often mistakes internal familiarity for depth. Writing exposes whether the thought can stand on its own. It turns feeling into language, language into structure, and structure into self-awareness. Intelligence grows in the moment a person stops asking, "What have I collected?" and starts asking, "What do I actually understand?" Habit 4. Building mental models. A high-functioning mind is rarely just a well-stocked container of facts. It is a pattern-detecting system. It sees the same logic moving through different forms. It notices that incentives in economics resemble motivations in psychology. That adaptation in biology echoes resilience in human behavior. That cause and effect in physics can sharpen the way we interpret decisions, relationships, and even identity. Charlie Munger described this as a latticework of mental models, and the phrase matters because it captures something many people miss. Intelligence is not only about knowing more. It is about having more structures through which reality can be interpreted. When the mind learns in isolated compartments, it stays rigid. But when ideas begin to connect across domains, thought becomes flexible. This is why so many of history's great minds moved across disciplines instead of staying trapped inside one. They were not just gathering information from different fields. They were building a richer architecture of perception. They could enter a new problem and see shape where other people saw only complexity. That kind of transfer is one of the deepest signs of intelligence. Not simply remembering what belongs to one category, but carrying an idea across contexts and recognizing its deeper pattern. The world becomes more legible when your mind is trained to look for structure instead of surface. A powerful intellect is often less like a library and more like a web. Its strength comes from connection. Habit 5. Deliberate memory training. People often speak about memory as if it were separate from intelligence, as if remembering were mechanical and reasoning were superior. But that division is misleading. A sharper memory does not just help you store knowledge. It changes the speed and richness with which thought can move. Nikola Tesla was known for mentally constructing machines in precise detail, rotating them internally, testing them before ever building them. Whether or not most people can reach that level is not the point. The point is that memory and imagination are deeply entangled. A mind that can hold more, retrieve more, and manipulate more internally gains enormous freedom in how it reasons. Ancient scholars understood this intuitively. They trained memory not as party trick, but as mental infrastructure. Because when information becomes easier to retrieve, the brain spends less effort searching blindly and more effort combining, evaluating, and transforming what it knows. Memory is not the opposite of intelligence. It is part of the scaffolding intelligence stands on. This is why active recall, spaced repetition, and explanation are so powerful. They do more than preserve information. They strengthen pathways of access. They teach the brain that knowledge is not something to glance at, but something to bring back into consciousness under effort. And that effort matters, because what you can retrieve shapes what you can think with. A mind cannot reason deeply with ideas it cannot reliably reach. Habit 6, protecting cognitive energy. One of the most mature things a person can learn about intelligence is that the brain is not a machine for constant output. It has rhythms, limits, vulnerable states. And when those are ignored for too long, mental sharpness begins to erode in ways that feel personal but are often physiological. Charles Darwin did not work in endless stretches to prove seriousness. He worked intensely for a few hours and then walked, rested, reflected. That rhythm was not laziness. It was respect for the conditions under which high-quality thought survives. Deep cognition requires energy, and energy is not created by pressure alone. Modern life quietly destroys this. Chronic stress narrows attention. Sleep deprivation weakens working memory and self-regulation. Constant stimulation fragments focus before it can mature into depth. People then blame themselves for feeling mentally dull, when in many cases their cognition is simply overtaxed and under-restored. There's something almost moralistic in the way we now talk about exhaustion, as if a tired brain should simply try harder. But the mind does not evolve through endless strain. It often evolves through oscillation. Intensity, then recovery. Focus, then release. Effort, then silence. Sometimes what looks like doing nothing is actually cognitive repair. Sometimes boredom is not wasted time at all. It is the nervous system stepping out of overload so that thought can become coherent again. Closing. So here's the deeper truth. Intelligence is not a trick. It is not a personality trait. It is not a label handed down by early performance and then frozen forever. It is a living system shaped by what you repeatedly ask your mind to do, and by the conditions in which you ask it to do it. The greatest thinkers did not become exceptional by obsessing over whether they were born exceptional. They built lives that trained the mind toward depth. They protected solitude. They tolerated confusion. They wrote to uncover thought. They crossed disciplines. They strengthened memory. They respected recovery. In a world addicted to speed, they created conditions for cognition to ripen. And maybe that is the part that matters most. Not whether you were once called gifted, not whether you scored high or low on something years ago, but whether you are living in a way that keeps your mind alive. Because the mind does not only reflect who you are, over time it becomes a record of what you practiced being. And once you really see that, the question changes. It is no longer, was I born smart enough? It becomes, what kind of mind am I training every day without even noticing?